Hi, this is Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
And this is Frank Hutchison.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast. Today I want to share some of the really interesting things I found while studying the history of beer in India, which, again, just like China, the British did not introduce beer to India. It has existed for millennia, but people didn't always realize that because of our definitions. So in ancient India, which was really a kind of loose, culturally connected group of city-states, and various empires would come in and conquer each other, you had two drinks. You had samras, which was for the higher class. It was regarded as a very spiritual drink. It was supposed to be consumed only by the elite for very special purposes. It had some hallucinogenic properties. It was supposed to bring you deeply spiritual insights. And, as a bonus, it had antioxidants. Woohoo! But there was this counterpart called Sura, or Surabhanam, and it was the drink of the masses. It was what civilians drank, and it was available for people of every class, and now we really know what the description of it was. It was made out of wheat, rice, or barley, and fermented using yeast.
What does that sound like?
Right? That sounds like beer. In fact, it's probably the oldest beer in India that predates the British by thousands of years. Warriors used to drink it before they went out for a fight. And this is all very interesting because a lot of the religious texts of India speak very negatively about beer and alcohol. It's prohibited. It's not supposed to be drunk. Even though Sura was supposedly the favorite of the god Indra. Now, we know that the traditional Indian culture interpretations of gods is not exactly the same as Western. They were not perfect beings. They were many different manifestations of different gods who are supposed to represent different aspects of the world and personalities. So their gods were not perfect. So they wouldn't have seen a contradiction between having religious texts that say, don't drink, it's bad, it's a sin, and a god who really, really likes beer. There was no contradiction there. It was a lesson to be learned. We know that they had rice beer, that they had many indigenous tribes that produced them. We know that they had ceremonial uses. Millet beer was also popular. And we know that it also helped keeping diseases like beriberi in check in these tribes early on. Now, in more recent days, modern world, India's having some trouble with these tribal beers and brews. In fact, it's reached the point that in some areas, elephant herds have learned to drink the rice beer, and they will actually come and attack villages because they've acquired a taste for the rice beer. It's a huge public health problem, and it's terrorizing people. The most interesting article I found, though, actually, first let me cover India Pale Ale. This is, everyone, if you drink beer, you know what an IPA is.
Yeah, you go to the local brew house, and that's what they advertise.
It's the most popular beer in the world. It's kind of tied with lager right now. They kind of go back and forth. But almost all homebrewers are making some kind of IPA. It's incredibly popular in Spokane. It's the top beer here. And its history is interesting because back in the 18th century, British sailors and the Navy and the settlers really missed their beer. As we've discussed in other episodes, porter was the thing. Beer was dark, it was brown, it was rich, and that's what they wanted, was this really intense beer. But they couldn't ship it to India because the temperatures were too hot, and by the time it got there, it was sour and disgusting. They tried doing mobile breweries on ships, and that did not work. And they couldn't get the right grains in India to make it taste properly. So finally, the Bow Brewery in East England came up with what we now call IPA. It was designed to be really strong in alcohol content, because that's how it was going to survive that voyage. It was also designed to have lots of extra hops in it to prevent the spoiling. So the founder added a lot more sugar and a lot more grains to it. And that's how we got India Pale Ale. It's called Pale Ale because of the color, and beers used to be this dark black or brown, but it's this light golden color. It was a huge amount of debate about whether this was done specifically for India or if they were doing it for every beer they were exporting. And there's a really fascinating article on beerinindia.wordpress.com that you can go check out that has a lot more information about this. We know that the brewer who was the inventor of the style, but we don't know if it was already... we call him the inventor of the style, but we don't know if it was just existing, and he's the guy who commercialized it and made it big. But it did get the name, and it now, between 1775 and 1800, sales of the beer increased 5-fold. And it's just kept going since then. It's now the most widely sold type of beer internationally, although it goes back and forth with lager. So, that's our modern context. But again, alcohol goes back even farther. In ancient India, there's the practice of Ayurvedic medicine, which is a naturopathic, a spiritual form of medicine where they believe that ailments can be cured using different foods you eat. And beer is very specifically mentioned as sura in these ancient texts, as we've discussed. It was said to be good for abdominal tumors, hemorrhoids, but it could aggravate the blood and caused an increase in fat tissue, urine, and blood. Similarly, wine was mentioned. There were a lot of herbal wines, which were discussed as having different benefits. They were considered to be a laxative. They could help with anemia, diabetes, worms, and hemorrhoids. And a lot of this tied to their belief about grains, because barley was supposed to help you fight diarrhea. It helped with urinary diseases. It gave strength to the body and could cure throat problems. They considered it an aphrodisiac. And they thought that if you fried it, it would cause indigestion and be hard to digest. So, of course, the best thing to do would be to soak it, bake it, or make beer out of it. Same thing with wheat. And so it was, even though you have this idea that drinking is a sin, they defined it really differently. And that's where this article, Drinking in Ancient India, by Dr., I hope I get his name right, Jyotsna Kamat, on kamat.com, is particularly interesting because he researched the drinking habits of ancient and medieval southern Indians, particularly in an area called Karnataka, which is kind of a southwestern cluster of city-states and a region. It still exists, but it's gone through many, many different empires over the last 2 millennia. And what he points out is that within their culture, yes, the ancient texts completely decry drinking. You're not supposed to do it. It's considered a minor sin, which could lead to specific punishment in their cultures. However, the culture is full of sculptures, literary works, wall paintings, and inscriptions talking about drinking being very, very common in these communities on certain occasions. You've got the Kannada Kavyas. It's this beautiful literary masterpiece that gives these lovely descriptions of drinking rituals and how they did them. And they mention how they brewed intoxicants. And we know this area had all sorts of very, very tasty flavored liquors and beers.
Do you by chance know what was the predominant religion in that area?
It was the natural religion. This is the thing. We're dealing with the Brahmins, the Jains, the Virashyavas. You have this kind of flux. Within India, you had multiple religions living together. So you have Proto-Hinduism, you have influence from the Chinese religions, and really everyone who's coming through. Jainism was present at the time. The
Muslim.
Mm-hmm. And you can't necessarily say there was one religion, because what you have are thousands and thousands of gods in India. And so each area had kind of its own way of interpreting that, which they wouldn't have necessarily seen as different from someone else's religion. It's just you subscribe to a different cult, a different god, a different system. Mm-hmm. And you may have interpreted sacred texts a little bit differently, which is all totally how things go.
And that was the same thing that they had in the Middle East.
It is. So, I mean, this is all very, very similar. And the kind of beers and alcohols they were making, you had very mild ones and strong ones. They came from rice, sweet barley, palm, and wild palm, which is ichala. And you even had milder ones that came from fruit, like mangoes and coconuts and dates. And they would flavor them with these flower essences. So you have sculptures, you have written literary works talking about drunkards and drinking scenes. It was really pretty prevalent. Though, at the same time, abstaining from alcohol was very respected, according to Dr. Kamat. The working class really liked, during this time period, about the 12th century, they really liked these liquors that were brewed from palm and wild palm drinks. It was extremely inebriating, but they were processed and tempered to be used by royalty as well, which is a really interesting shift. You have something that's popular with the working class that the royals have found a way to refine and make better for them, as opposed to the royals having the very, very nice version and the people figuring out how to make a cheaper version of it, which I thought was very interesting. We know that in the 12th century, this very celebrated poet historian mentions the king's soldiers, who were used to a very mild grape wine flavored with saffron, were really enjoying this, they called it a toddy, made of palms and coconuts on the banks of the river. They were bitter and foamy and sweet, and they were very intoxicating to people who were used to mild wine. We know that drinking was not, in many other cultures, drinking was about sustenance, it was about food. But what we see in this culture is that drinking was a form of entertainment, and that continues to be a difference between Indians and the Western world. It was an amusement, and for Westerners, it was part of their food in moderation. Indians, to quote Dr. Kamat, Indians knew about the narcotic effect of alcohol, and it was made freely available on the battlefield when wounded soldiers needed relief from excruciating pain. And according to Yan Chuang, Yuan Shuang, the Chinese pilgrim in about 639 AD, sharp swords were tied to the trunks of inebriated elephants and let loose on enemy battalions during this time period. I mean, it caused absolute destruction. And in order to send the soldiers out so they could actually fight this, they got them dead drunk.
And that is not an uncommon thing to do in history.
It's not.
Is that, especially if you're facing what is considered a hopeless cause,
It
getting
was
your soldiers
liquid courage.
inebriated was a way of encouraging them to go out and die.
And in many cases, it was tied to sacred rituals, so you were consecrating what you were doing. We also know that a little bit before that, about 578 AD, in a cave in Badami, there's a picture of an inebriated young man giving a lecture on temperance as part of the sculptures and the pictures in this particular area. There is also 3 couples who have forgotten themselves over glasses of goblet when 2 servants are ready at hand to fill them again. Dr. Kamat mentions that there's another panel with 2 women are sipping away and chattering. Presiding deity at the Kolar temple was a Shakti goddess named Kolarama, and you have wine and meat were essential ingredients in Shakti goddess worship. The inscriptions mention a very specific kind of intoxicating drink, and the deity is even holding a goblet in her hand. You have drinking couples. You have a man collecting toddy from a tall tree, and a woman is pouring the collected toddy into the pot, from the pot into a leather bag, and you've got another guy with a donkey ready to transport it. This toddy tapping collection and transportation was a very common scene until, he says, about 20 years ago in this region. But modernizations had a different effect on how people approach that. But what's so interesting here is that for instance, going back to this idea of drinking leisurely and being different, you have the goddess of wine, Madhudavet, who would be invoked, and the Mother Earth as well. And then they would pour liquor on the head, or set it on the head. It's not quite clear there. They either set it on the head or they would pour some as a mark of respect. And then they would pour more liquor into these artistically shaped bowls, he says, with bird heads and carved from mother of pearls, beautiful shells, and then offered to the elders. And then the youngsters would help themselves. He says lovers, married couples, family members, friends, and relatives joined in drinking bouts. Drinking among women along with gossip was common. And various snacks were consumed in between roast meat, onion bandas, fried graham egg, and fish fries, as also peppery tender mangoes and the pulp of bilva seasoned with salt, ginger, and pepper. So they did this to avoid inebriation. And he said they also would do a dose of ghee, which is a clarified melted butter where they remove the milk solids, and then herbal medicine. It's Kana Kadasa, was a well-respected saint poet, he said, and his great epic, Mohan Ataran Gini, has these realistic descriptions of drinking in a colony in the 16th century with the working class. He says, as evening advanced, the courtyard of houses was cleaned, and rangoli was drawn, which is a kind of drink. Pots, which perhaps contained wine, were kept on the mounds with rice, gram, and pinyara, which was an offering that they gave to the gods, and they put flowers and leaves and paste, and they would do beautiful dances. And then after worshipping Shakti goddess, they would start drinking. Toddy would be passed around in these coconut shells, and they'd ask others to drink. They actually have his quotes here about the dialogues. Drink the celestial beauty, drink my golden doll, drink the moon-faced, curly-haired mate. The lover made his beloved drink, and the woman who got intoxicated quickly made their boyfriends gulp down more and more by words. Drink my heartthrob, drink the civilized one, drink my handsome, I can't go on if you stop. And then they would serve drinks with that as well. And it's a really interesting balance and dichotomy here that drink was considered a minor sin, but it was also tolerated. It was part of worship, and it's part of the problem is we're trying to talk about ancient India, which was not a homogeneous group. That at any point in time, you had people trying to do whatever they needed to live. And in some cases, that was to be entertained. In some cases, that was liquid courage for the battlefield. In other cases, it was reserving it for worship. And in some cases, it was abstaining as part of a religious life. Which is why the history of India is so fascinating. Because you're not really talking about the history of one culture. You're talking about the amazing 1,000-unit Venn diagram. You have 1,000 circles that overlap with each other in all these different ways, and you really get to see how a single supply, how a single product like alcohol, like beer or wine, could fill so many different needs depending on the forces.
And the many different ways that it was featured and informed, that you don't have a uniform product, but rather thousands of products.
Yep.
Which
Over
may
and
not
over
be
again.
used beyond a single village.
Yep, like we have one kind, that very Syrah, that very strong beer that was popular with the elite warrior class. You had the peasant population, you had different spirits, you had people just trying to keep juice functioning and alive for a long time so that they could keep drinking it in times of feast and famine.
Gets me about this is that what you're describing isn't much dissimilar from what was happening in the United States.
No.
You know, you had beer production was basically a local enterprise. It wasn't until relatively modern times with industrialization that you started getting to where you have a uniform product available all over the country. PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer.
Oh, yes.
You know, it's sort of ubiquitous. Everybody has that. But you also have these local brands that are only there. And you had some, in the case like Coors, at one point, you could not get it east of the Mississippi. In fact, Smokey and the Bandit was all about delivering Coors beer to Atlanta.
Yep. Well, that's the thing, is that we have our idea of what beer is now, what a brand is now, what the use is now, which is very much biased by industrialization. And we forget that this filled a need in people's lives. It filled many different needs in people's lives that are very different from how we use it today. And that's what we're going to discuss some more in our other episodes. So thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.